All right, let's go ahead and get started. Let's. All right. Our CLE sign-ups are right down here in front. If you haven't signed up yet, sign up before you leave the room. Right now, we're about to have a panel. Fracking water. Where is it coming from? And with a title like that, I think I know who came up with it. But we've got three great speakers today. Our setup is going to be each of the speakers is going to give a presentation, and then at the end of it, we're going to do a question and answer. So hopefully, if you have a question about one person's presentation, maybe the next one will answer that. So when we've gone through all three of them, then we'll go ahead and open it up. We should have about half an hour, I think, for questions and answers. By the way, my name's Chris Dalbum. I'm program manager here at Tulane Law School, Tulane Institute on Water Resources, Law and Policy, and I am a veteran of, as a student, putting on these things. So I greatly appreciate all the work that everybody's put in this year, putting this together. Our first speaker is Hugh Penn, who is the attorney at the Delta chapter of the Sierra Club, and a frequent face seen at past years at the summit, and we're happy to have him here again. And he was going to be talking about, well, how much water does get used in fracking. He's going to set the table for us. So, Hugh.
Good morning. My job today is to answer one simple question, and that is how much fresh, public Louisiana water has been extracted and converted and used as fracking fluid. It's an easy question to ask. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of public data available. So I can't answer the question. That's the end of my presentation. I did find a PowerPoint put together by DNR, which is the agency regulating this water use in Louisiana. It's entitled Hydraulic Fracturing Regulatory Process in Louisiana. There are three fields, three fracturing plays: the Brown Dents, the Haynesville, and the Tuscaloosa. So we can get started using the information on this PowerPoint, but it's incomplete at best. And let's see, here it comes. Okay, water use statistics. 9,453,000,000 gallons of total frac water used in Haynesville play, which is one of the three plays, in 29 months from 2009 to 2012. That's 5.5 million gallons per well of total water and almost 5 million gallons a well of frac fluid. Now, this is a huge number, 9.5 billion gallons, because of what the industry does to the water once they extract it. And I believe the other speakers are going to address that. So they add 40 to 50 chemicals, some of which are known carcinogens. It's shot down whole, where it's contaminated again with super concentrations of brine and with what they call naturally occurring radioactive material. Nobody wants to talk about that, so I thought I would raise it. So even this huge number, 9.5 billion gallons, is grossly insufficient for our purposes because it's only Haynesville for 29 months. It's only gas well production in Haynesville. And there have been 26 months of production since this report was issued. Also, since that time, 2012, the length of the lateral drilling has increased, in many cases, up to a mile. The longer you go out, the further you go out, the more water that you use. The Sierra Club was recently involved in an action under the Scenic Rivers Act to convince Wildlife and Fisheries to not grant Scenic Rivers permits for extraction of water for fracking from 3 scenic rivers. And those were 6 wells, and 5 of the 6, the frackers wanted 12 million gallons, and on the 6th they wanted 25 million gallons. So the 5 million gallon per well statistic in this PowerPoint is outdated. We were successful, and those permits were voluntarily withdrawn, but they will be back. So why is this? Why don't we have this information? First of all, public water is free in Louisiana. The state doesn't charge you for it. There's no excise tax. Even Texas charges for public water. So that's something to think about. There is a document that the industry has to fill out after they complete a well, which requires volume and source. But there's no requirement that the document actually be filed. There's no time period that it has to be filed. There's no penalty. And there's no requirement that the fracking industry put flow gauges to measure the water that they use on their wells. And there's essentially no public reporting. I was lucky to stumble across this one document. So that's where we are, 9.5 billion gallons for one 29-month period before lateral links were extended, and basically no other statistics available. Short and sweet.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Assistant Attorney General for Louisiana, Ryan Seidman. What did I do? It shouldn't be.
All right, thank y'all for having me here today. I'm going to talk about really kind of the Louisiana perspective on not where is the water going, but where is it coming from, and what is the legal regime that we operate under here in Louisiana? What are the constraints that we, as the government actors, have in the process of the use of water for fracking and other purposes, as well as no, I don't remember what the as well as was. Oh well. All right, so why do we care about water? Well, gee, Jim, thanks for joining us. It's not, I think we've already covered this through the previous speaker, but basically, you know, this is it. Historically in Louisiana, little consideration has been given to water rights, and it really, I think that it has a lot to do with the abundance of water in Louisiana. We're a wet state, and so why would we consider this thing that we have in such abundance? And, you know, that seems to have been the approach that the legislature has taken to this resource for the last 203 years since statehood. With that in mind, I think you also have to look at it through a historic lens, because, and I guess I should preface that with the idea that we don't have a water code in Louisiana. There is no specific series of law that says this is how all of this stuff is supposed to behave, such that when a fracking need comes up, we don't have a model to plug it into as to how to deal with it. And so we've been trying to cobble this stuff together over the last several years since the Haynesville Shale hit and started putting real demands on it. But, you know, I think this is not surprising in a historic context, because most of the uses of especially surface water in Louisiana for the last 200 years have been flow-through uses. You know, it might be used to power a well, it might be used for agricultural purposes, never mind the I think, misnomer in 2010 when the agricultural water law was enacted that seemed to suggest that it will, that an agricultural use of water isn't a use. We'll put that silliness aside for the moment and just say that, you know, historic water uses for farming purposes until modern agricultural methods was minimal. It just wasn't something that was then rising to the level of a concern for the legislature. And so that's really how we've gotten to where we are today with the lack of direction from the legislature. Recent droughts, and then especially the Haynesville Shale fracking activity, has changed the public consciousness, I think, of what the issues are. This is really just a demonstrative slide, and it shows both permitted and actual wells in the Haynesville Shale play. I think I did this screen grab maybe 6 or 8 months ago, so you can see a little bit of things through the Tuscaloosa Marine Shale as well in the Florida parishes. But, you know, you look at Louisiana as a whole, and it's just a big pink blob up there over the Haynesville Shale play. There are a lot of wells there. Zooming in isn't much better. So we're talking about roughly 2,400 permitted or operating gas wells in the Haynesville Shale play. These don't include your Cotton Valley, shallower oil wells. These are the Haynesville Shale natural gas wells. And at the time that we tried to do some calculations, and when I say we, this is a very unscientific, Ryan did the calculations, the we is me, of how much water was being used at that time for this fracking activity. It was 1.4 billion gallons. And, you know, a not insignificant amount. Now, you look at that from the perspective of, say, flow down the Mississippi River, flow down the Red River. Well, it's not so much. But they're not traveling, or they're not transporting this water for those long distances to get to the Haynesville Shale. It's coming out of small waterways in Louisiana, and there, the 1.4 billion gallons is a significant draw on the surface water resources. So, what difference does it make? Why, from a legal standpoint, why do we care? Well, the Commissioner of Conservation, who is an Assistant Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources, has identified that there are areas of quote-unquote groundwater concern in Louisiana. This is areas where we've got groundwater aquifers that are low. They are in danger of being substantially depleted, and depending on where in the state that is, that has different impacts on the resource itself. Recognizing that about the time that the Haynesville Shale play was going online in the mid-2000s, the Commissioner said, folks, you got to lay off this stuff. Stop pulling from the groundwater resources, and instead, well, surface water, we're not really at a risk for running out of that. Why don't you use that instead? You know, say what you will about what the Commissioner did. In that regard, he certainly did shift the burden of the water usage from, in some cases, a threatened resource to a less threatened resource. It didn't solve any problems, though. But that is what has gotten us to where we are today, which is, and I see several folks in the room who are working on these projects as well as our office, to beginning to think about what a water code for Louisiana would look like. It was this shift from groundwater use to surface water use that all of a sudden made the use of water in Louisiana much more visible, and it was starting to draw attention of the public, which raised it to the level of some of the governmental actors. All right, let's back up for a second, talk about the legal scheme within which we're operating here. All right, the Civil Code says, well, basically the question is who owns this stuff, who gets to permit it, who gets to say who uses what? Because in a lot of cases, what the folks were doing in these early days of the Haynesville Shale when the Commissioner said shift to surface water, was they were going to farmers, they were going to anybody and saying, hey, can I put a pipe in there? Can I draw water from there? And nobody was really checking with there was certainly no kind of public trust investigation as to whether or not this was impacting the state writ large or even in a regional or local perspective. And that's when our office, Attorney General's office, started getting complaints from concerned citizens saying, hey, people are sticking pipes in here, and by the way, that bayou just ran dry. So we began to look at this question of, do we have jurisdiction here? And when I say we, in that regard, I mean we, the state, writ broadly. So the first question is, who owns this stuff? And the Civil Code speaks to this. It says that public things that belong to the state are such as running waters and the waters and bottoms of natural navigable water bodies. So it's two categories of things. It's two ways that the state actually owns surface water. So there could be a scenario where we don't own some surface water. But they're going to be fairly narrow situations. So running waters, I think we can all intuitively understand what that means. Streams, creeks, and the interesting thing here is that the Civil Code distinguishes between running waters and the waters over naturally navigable water bottoms. And so we have a situation where we don't have to own the bottom to own the water itself. So it's a very convenient thing for me because an awful lot of my time is spent on questions of navigability. I don't have to go there to know whether or not we can assert control over the water itself. And then when you look to the waters and bottoms of natural navigable water bodies, this gives us another catch-all for things that aren't intuitively flowing or quote-unquote running waters. So your lakes, larger ponds, things like that, that certainly may have aspects of running water, but don't intuitively appear to be running. So we get down into smaller areas that are lakes that maybe don't have a navigable component. They're not ours, they're artificial impoundments and things like that, or ponds and things like that that are completely cut off and are fed from other sources or are diverted and then filled up and done with them. Those haven't really come to us yet in terms of whether we need to deal with those, and we haven't been challenged yet on this interpretation of the law. And that becomes relevant in a minute. Anyway, so that's the civil code guidance that we have going into this. We also have relevant constitutional articles, and I'm sure everybody in here, at least those of y'all from Louisiana, are familiar with Article 9, Section 1, the Public Trust Doctrine, which charges government actors in Louisiana with an obligation to protect the public trust resources, the environment, water, air, all these things. There's certainly an awful lot of debate, and has been for some time, over whether this constitutional provision is in fact basically a self-activating provision, or does it need legislative action to give it legs. At this point, as we'll get to in a second, it does have some legs now with regard to water. It didn't, and it was a vague constitutional charge when we began this task around 2008, 2009. But what actually, and sadly from my perspective, but what actually we used as much more leverage in the early days before we were able to get legislative action on this to be able to exert some control over surface water usage was Article 7, Section 14A of the Constitution, which is a much less well-known provision. And that provision says, hey, you can't give away state stuff for free. And this provision has existed in one form or another in the state constitution since about the 1870s. And what we started to recognize was that we don't need necessarily the public trust doctrine to be able to tell us that we can regulate the environmental concerns of the surface water usage, where we can simply say, water has value, you're taking it from the state, and therefore you owe us for it. And we did use that in the 2008, 2009, 2010 period to shut down certain operations around the state, to force certain folks to do environmental analyses, and basically it was kind of a whack-a-mole situation. We don't have a water police in Louisiana. No question about it. And so the only way we know about things going on is either through Office of Conservation permits for drilling, or through reporting from various sources saying, hey, somebody's stealing water. So we were playing whack-a-mole, and to some extent we still are. But using really as the legs for our authority here, Article 7, Section 14A. A lot of people brought up, for those of y'all from Louisiana who might be thinking about this, a lot of people brought up 9-1101, which says there shall never be any charge assessed against any person for the use of the waters of the state for municipal, industrial, agricultural, or domestic purposes. That seems to be completely at odds with the concept that this is a public thing under the Civil Code. And it seems to directly conflict with Article 7, Section 14A, which says we can't give away public stuff. And really, you look around the nation, certainly there is no market for water. It is not a traded commodity yet. But it certainly, just because of that, we certainly know that it has value. In fact, certain state agencies, Sabine River Authority being a primary one, is selling water. So we know that this thing has value, and we stand behind that to say that this is a thing of value of the state. So we have two questions here with regard to this provision. Is this something we need to be worried about? Is this undermining the state's authority to regulate water usage? The answer from our perspective, and we've said this in several Attorney General's opinions on this topic, is no. That another portion of that article confirms that we do own the stuff. And we think this is a recreational use provision. It's basically saying you can't stop folks from boating in public waters. You can't stop them from fishing in public waters. But that doesn't mean that they can simply take the stuff unilaterally. And even if it does mean that, and if you go back and look at the history of this, this was actually enacted when waters were classified differently under the Civil Code in 1910 than they are today. But even if it does mean that, this statute is in direct conflict then with Article 7, Section 14A, and must fail, or at least must be subsumed by that statute. All right. So briefly, a couple of examples of how these things are whack-a-mole and how we developed our theories on this. Beginning in 2008, we started to get reports of folks illegally taking water out of either state waterways or not state waterways. The first time it was addressed by our office officially was in Attorney General Opinion 080176, and this came in as a call to our office, and they said, hey, somebody's parking a tanker truck on a bridge, they've stuck a hose over the edge and are pumping out this creek. Can they do that? I don't know. We looked into the legal issues, some of the stuff that I just talked about. This thing is not a state-claimed water bottom. It is not a naturally navigable waterway, so we don't have claim to the bottom itself, and we thought that that really cut off our authority here outside of a public trust doctrine theory. But once we started looking at Article 450 and this concept of running waters, we said, wait a second, there's a running creek. Yeah, you can't do that. And by the way, if any of y'all are interested in these AG opinions, my email's at the end of this. Feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to provide them all to you. We synthesized them a year or so ago in a Tulane law article, so that's out there too. But anyway, this is basically the substance of what we concluded. That we're only talking about the water, so we don't care if this thing is a navigable water bottom or not. It doesn't matter. We're not asserting claim to this thing for the purposes of the bottom, and that, especially in the Haynesville Shale, is a massive statement from the state. It is saying, we're not taking your minerals, but we still are concerned about your water use. So that's what all of that says. Take my word for it. Anyway, there were several opinions requests that came in about the same time and then were released at the same time. 090028. And by the way, none of these, like I said, have been challenged, and they still remain really, I think, founded on solid legal principles, but you hate to say good law about an AG opinion, but I'm just going to say it. I think they are still sound and solid. I didn't write them, so I'm not patting myself on the back. This was my staff. Anyway, so in this case, we did have a twist on the issue, and it was Smithport Lake and Clear Lake in DeSoto Parish. These things are artificial impoundments, so they are not your traditional running waters. Do we own this water? Can we say, this is a state resource, you cannot take it? This one happened to be a real unique situation that we said, yes, we can. And the reason that we said that was, these are not state-claimed water bottoms. It is sitting on top of private land that we have taken a servitude of flood, basically, to create these impoundments with. But in that scenario, in the contracts where we acquired the rights to the land, we also acquired the rights from the landowners to control the water that is flooding their property. And so we basically dovetailed in there and said, it's not running water, it's not a state navigable water bottom, so we don't get it through those two, but we get these through contract. No, you cannot simply stick a siphon in here and start fracking with this water without state authorization. And of course what we say in these opinions as well, and that's what's in the detail of this, is that what does that state authorization mean? Well, certainly under Article 7, Section 14A, we can't just say, here you go, take the water. You got to pay us for it. So there has to be some assessment of fair market value, which becomes a complex issue with respect to water in Louisiana, no question. But before we can take that action, there's got to be some measure of environmental review. That is a constitutional duty imposed on us from our perspective, and in these opinions we note that, whether there is a statute saying so directly or not. And I'll give a nod to Jim Wilkins in the front row here. We took his approach to interpretation of the public trust doctrine and said, we're going to have to abide by that, even though there is no statutory pronouncement telling us we do. And so at that point, we began to cooperate with the Department of Natural Resources to do environmental reviews of requests to withdraw water from Louisiana's surface water sources. Again, same time, opinion 0291 of 2009. This one was coming out of the Red River. So we don't have the depletion concerns coming out of the Red River like we do coming out of, say, McElroy Creek. It's a massive amount of water traveling down that thing. But interestingly, it was the city of Shreveport who wanted to sell this stuff. Can they do it? Yes and no. And ultimately, we said no. The yes is, in this case, the city of Shreveport was arguing, look, we own the property fronting on the river. So we're the riparian, and under the Civil Code, riparians have certain rights. We can exercise those rights to authorize the sale of this water. And we said no. You may be the riparian, but you can't sell a state resource without proper authorizations. And hey, there's no scheme in place for that. You're going to have to come through this cobbled together process that we've put together. This was before legislation. And so what we did tell them they could do is they could put in a pipeline and sell their right-of-way across their property all they wanted to put in a pipeline to transport the water. They just didn't sell the water. They didn't like that answer. But ultimately, it was a state resource. And so they couldn't divest that without compensation, and compensation through the state, and also an environmental review of the impacts. And that's basically what this slide says. Again, I'm happy to share these slides as well if you all want later, so don't feel like you got to scribble like Matt. All right. Alligator Bayou in Red River Parish was the subject of another one of these opinions. Again, it was another non-state claimed water bottom. And the question here became, do you have to get authority from the riparian owner as well as the state to withdraw running surface water? And in this case, basically, this was the opportunity for us to go through the riparian analysis and say that the riparians have the authority to authorize your access to the waterway, but they don't have the right to authorize your use of running water. Now, certainly riparians can use running water in Louisiana, right? They can divert it onto their property under the Civil Code for their use on their property, so long as they return it to the stream before it leaves their property. And what we talk about in this opinion is this idea that you're not supposed to diminish the resource. And that's really the measure of consumption for the purposes of whether the state has to be compensated or not. Because again, we go back to where did this concept come from? These Civil Code articles have been in one form or another in existence since the 1808 Digest in Louisiana. They are agricultural, agrarian, society-based concepts of the creation of very small-scale fishing ponds or stuff to water your crops and things like that on your property that aren't going to impact in a massive way the ecology of a region. And so, our perspective is, yeah, riparians have some rights, no question. We can't dispute that. We don't dispute that. And I think it's that nod to the riparian rights that has kept the state so far from being sued over these pronouncements and over the fact that we're collecting money and private folks aren't. In most cases. Some cases they are too. And in some cases, the water still is so cheap that folks are taking leases from multiple, or not leases, but are basically compensating multiple folks for the water usage. Anyway, so that's what this one goes into. It talks about the issues of riparian uses historically, and this opinion came out right about the time the Louisiana legislature enacted Act 955 of 2010, which was the first attempt to codify some concept of surface water usage in Louisiana. And look, I was on the team that helped draft 955, and I will be the first one to tell you it is far from perfect, but it is something. What is unfortunate about Act 955 is, what is, I think, most unfortunate about Act 955 is that once the push to do this, to start to codify some amount of water law in Louisiana, made it to the legislature, made it through the legislature, there was then a lot of ambivalence again, because the Haynesville Shale started to cool off, water usages started to diminish, and there wasn't the urgency. The droughts started to end that were impacting us. And so, although this had a sunset provision for 2012, and the idea was that by the end of 2012, we would have replaced it with a comprehensive water code, never happened. And at the end of 2012, it was renewed. At the end of in 2014, it was renewed again. And I expect it will probably have to be continually renewed still. I'm going to have to move on some. But anyway, this one sets up a scheme that requires environmental analyses. It requires compensation to the state. The permitting process runs through the Department of Natural Resources, and DNR now has on staff a hydrologist who can examine concepts of, or not concepts, can examine the actual impact of the water usages to the ecology. Act 994, I just bring this up to note, it's the one I referenced before that deals with agricultural, aquacultural exceptions to 955. It certainly the recent report that what organization did it? Was it the Water Law Institute? No, it was the Law Institute, wasn't it? The one last year. The Law Institute report on water usage noted, as we have in our article on this, that this law is probably unconstitutional. This exception that's been carved out. Anyway, how much more time do I have? Like 30 seconds. Okay, so there are surface water use agreements that you can obtain from the Department of Natural Resources now to comply with this law. Those are the extensions. The water report I talked about goes through all this stuff, lots of important stuff, and found basically the same stuff that we just talked about. Let's see. Yeah, I overestimated. Anyway, like I said, you guys are welcome to the slides. You're welcome to the opinions. You're welcome to a copy of the article. There's my contact information. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email. This is stuff that we've been working on at the AG's office constantly, and we'll continue to. We're now on the the Law Institute's Water Committee, and are working with the Water Campus in Baton Rouge on these issues. So please, it's like an open door. If you got information, please feel free to send it. We'd be happy to have it as we go through the process of working on this water code. I'll shut up and sit down. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. And we will, once again, we will have time for questions at the end here. Now I'd love to introduce to you Sheila Hollis. In addition to being a partner at Duane Morris and having an amazing career in energy law, and being the first director of the Office of Enforcement for FERC, and being a trial lawyer for the Federal Power Commission, and being a lecturer or 20 years at GW, and being one of the 50 key women in energy worldwide, all of that stuff is great and important. But for us here, I don't know if you heard Dean Meyer mention it or not this morning, but the Tulane Environmental Law Summit won an award from the ABA for being top student-run event in the country in environmental law. The reason that award exists is because of our next speaker. And the big reason why we even submitted for that award is because of our next speaker. So for that reason alone, we are extremely pleased and happy to have Sheila Hollis here with us.
Thank you. And two other important facts. I'm here on behalf of the Federal Bar Association. I chair the section of Energy and Environment and Resources of the Federal Bar Association, which has been very supportive of this effort for many years. It has sent a speaker, and this is my first turn at bat. And more importantly, even than that, is my daughter's a graduate of Tulane Medical. Yay! Okay. So it's an honor to be here. I've done a lot of work in Louisiana on a variety of issues over many decades, and it is a joy to be here and to share a little bit of time with you this morning. Obviously, I'm not a Louisiana lawyer. I'm a national energy and international energy and environmental lawyer. I went to Rio Plus 20. I've done all that. But on behalf of the American Bar Association. But I'm here to talk about what are some of the driving factors in the development of fracking oil, gas, but primarily gas, and why so much that Ryan discussed very well with respect to Louisiana is being reflected on a national and international stage, because there is an enormous amount of activity. There's an enormous amount of pros and cons, and I hope to go through that and not to steal a little bit of old time discussion about water in particular. I've done a lot of work in the water issues out west in particular. At least you have the joy here of actually having water. And in California, if you've ever seen that Mark Reisner special and they read the book Cadillac Desert, you know it's a whole different scene out there. And there they say whiskey is for drinking and water's for fighting. And I'd say that at least you have the benefit of actually having water, and being able to figure out how to clean it up and to manage it better is a heck of a lot better spot to be in than a lot of folks in the West are. Okay. It all depends on your perspective, whether we're in a good time in history or a bad time in history. And I heard the rather profound and sort of doomsday perspective on global climate change. I'm not here to talk really about global climate change, except as it affects as how the issue and our response to it domestically and internationally impacts what's going on with respect to fracking, pipeline construction, exports, and the like in the U.S. The U.S. is now the world's largest natural gas producer and is, in fact, the world leader in shale gas production as of now. We kind of it's technology that was really invented and perfected here over the course of a number of decades. Gas production is going to grow tremendously. Obviously, we're in the midst of a price downturn, which will cause some lagging in the development of natural gas. Louisiana has benefited and also been impacted negatively by natural gas and development over the course of its history, its recent history, and I don't expect that is going to change. It provides jobs, tax base, and so on, which is the good part, and the bad part is the environmental impact, which still is not under control. But there's a lot of people working on the issue, and I, being the eternal optimist and being Irish, I always look on the bright side. There is an enormous amount of work and an awful lot of very smart people devoted to addressing it throughout government, throughout national government, and the states as well. Our consumption of natural gas is growing extremely dramatically, and I will explain why. Many of you already know it probably from the program here, but as a result of a variety of developments with respect to the decline in the use of coal-fired generation and the decline in the use of nuclear generation, and I heard the presentation this morning by the very brilliant French consul. Well, France is able to get by with a lot less GHG emissions because their nuclear fleet has supported their electric generation for the last 70 years of France's existence. And it's just the way that their structure is set up with respect to electric generation. Well, here about 20% of our generation is nuclear. It's declining though because the plants are old. They have problems. There's issues associated with what to do with the waste, that issue is not going to be resolved even when the plant's shut down. There's a whole lot of issues associated with nuclear generation, and one by one the plants are kind of slipping off the side of the table, and so you're going to see heavier dependence on alternative sources. Now, development of renewables has developed pretty rapidly. It still is only probably in renewables. Let me say there's renewables and then there's renewables. Hydroelectric is a renewable. Some find hydroelectric in certain circumstances is a fantastic thing. In other circumstances, not so great because of impact, again, on water supply. impact on fisheries, impact on environment, land use, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of hydro in the country still, and that would be included in an overall description of renewable energy. Semicolon, however, but over the past 20, 25 years, we've invested very heavily solar, wind, and a variety of other generation sources, biomass in certain cases, but basically it's been mostly solar and wind power. And also, we've invested extremely heavily in efficiency, building design, urban design, a variety of other approaches, and also industrial use of hydrocarbons. So that has declined. So you have a mix, you have a changing mix of supply and demand all the time. But bottom line is the grid still needs to be fed, and you still need reliability on the grid. And that's what's driving the development of natural gas-fired generation. Because as these things go, it's easier to build. It's not the easiest, but it's easier to, it's certainly, coal is just off the table, forget coal. Oil-fired generation pretty much non-existent except for backup in emergency situations where the gas supply fails at a plant because of cold or shortage, or the nuclear plant shuts down for reliability reasons or other reasons. So that leaves natural gas, and that will probably go up to 30-35%. That would be my guess over the next 10, 15 years of electric generation will come from that source as the coal plants go away. And if you follow what Gina McCarthy, head of EPA, said, she just gave a major speech to the National Governors Association on the Clean Power Plant Plan. And in that, it's pretty clear that natural gas is going to be a mainstay bridge fuel to the future. So the availability of fracking has kind of been, over the past 10 years, kind of sort of magically appeared on the scene as being the panacea, because we had a mindset. I hate to tell you, when I came into Washington, we had was the oil and gas shortage period. There wasn't enough natural gas to go around. We were having emergencies of every sort. People were freezing in New York and in the upper Midwest, no gas supply. So we grew up in this mindset of scarcity, 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 scarcity. Massive amounts of natural gas imported from Canada, and a lot of the LNG terminals, which I will probably I'll tell you about more than you care to know probably by the time you're out of here. But the natural gas terminals were built to import natural gas from Algeria, Nigeria, Indonesia, wherever we could get natural gas supply in order to supply A, heating requirements, but B, also the electric generation that was already built that was reliant and becoming more reliant on natural gas. So here we are. We're obviously in a changing world with respect to natural gas and oil prices, but that will probably modulate over time. We've been to this movie before. The price of gas and oil can zip up in them very, very quickly. Who's the players? Obviously, the administration and Congress are at the heart of this. Back and forth, controversial issue, development of fracking, the use of water, emissions from fracking, land use, the host of issues that go hand in hand with it, but it still is viewed as a bridge fuel, and the president and the administration, they don't beat it to death, but the fact of the matter is that they rely very heavily on natural gas in the developments going forward. If you follow this at all in the fracking world, you know there's been a lot of oversight hearings, inquiries, legislation proposed to change the industry, modify the industrial practices, and so on, but still this secret sauce is moving forward. The states still have primary authority. Why is that? Well, it's interesting because in the non-fracking world, where natural gas was just developed by traditional methods, not the fracking methods, a lot of the gas came A, from Canada, or B, from resources located on public lands or in the OCS. And fracking was not utilized as much. Some, but not as much. But now so much of the fracking is in areas of the country where the wells had been either on ice or there had been reserves that hadn't been developed. Well, now so much of it is done on private lands, and that's changed the dynamics of it. It isn't as easy to get your arms around as when it's on public lands, Bureau of Indian Affairs, BLM lands, the Department of Agriculture, Rural Rural Electric Service had some opportunities there, but a variety of public lands that made it easier to come up with a national rule and enforce it. So it's sort of helter-skelter and scattered the way, and it depends on where you're located, your perception of the oil and gas industry, your reliance on the natural gas industry and oil industry to support other tax base and employment base in the state. And also, it's very local. Some folks they see it as a tremendous benefit to have the fracking on their property because they may own the mineral rights. Other folks are not that lucky, so it's very neighbor against neighbor. You go up to Pennsylvania, you go to Ohio, and it's very it varies almost from household to household, the feelings about it. It depends on, some people are getting rich and buying Cadillacs, and other people who are right down the street are watching them get rich and buy Cadillacs. And that's what's driving even more of the unrest and unhappiness about it. Another issue that is evolving is the seismic impacts of fracking, which is very much under study. I'll return to that in a minute, but that's influencing a lot of mindsets, even in areas of the country where there is an acceptance and basically a welcoming of natural gas and fracking in general. But just some of the players involved, Department of Interior, who directly or indirectly they're involved. Department of Energy, obviously, they're setting the pace. They've convened groups to study it, and a huge group of top of the industry people have been brought together, not just people in industry, but scientists, NGOs, the whole package of players around the table. And there's a huge amount of money and effort being poured into this by a variety of agencies. Even the SEC, a lot of reporting associated with the fracking process and the SEC process. Otherwise, you would never think that the SEC would care that much about it, but they do. Pipeline transportation, safety of natural gas pipelines, they're in on it too. USGS, BIA, even the GAO cares about this. And you say why? Because, well, the GAO and also the Department of Interior, they're watching what the royalties are. Not much of it's located on public land, but enough of it is, and the royalties are very significant, and they support a lot of things. So when the royalties go down, it impacts the U.S. Treasury, too. Health and Human Services cares about the health impacts, Department of Defense, Army Corps of Engineers, and the like. Get this little thing to change for me. There we go. But here, this just gives you a sense of the magnitude of what's going on in the country. You see the massive, massive development at 2040, assuming there's still a world, which I wasn't too sure of after based on the global climate change panel this morning. You know, we're still around. We're going to have a lot of gas. Always looking on the bright side. Silver linings, you know. We will be able to have that outdoor barbecue, by God. So, and most of it's going to be shale gas. Certainly in the country, in the U.S., it's going to be shale gas. That's where the action is. That's where the magic is. And just give you a sense of who all is who among the states. Yeah, you know, places where they've been kind of sleeping on natural gas for the last 30, 40 years. They're very much alive and kicking in it. Marcellus is obviously place where there's a huge amount of action. The Utica Shale, up in the Bakken, it's basically driving so much of the economy of South Dakota. I spent a lot of time in Colorado, enormous amounts of fracking going on out there, every which way. New Mexico, Wyoming, all over, and some of the biggest opportunities for fracking are in California, but you know, for obvious reasons, because California is very, very controlling. It's not being developed as much, but there still is some development out there. And obviously the usual suspects: Texas and Louisiana, Alabama, some. But the amazing thing is seeing it wake up in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region and Midwest, where it's just every which way. If you go up into Pennsylvania, for those of you who haven't been up there where there's fracking is going on, it's pretty shocking to see how it's changed the world there, in good and bad ways. Yes, there's activity all over, and some of it's negative for a lot of people, but my God, the amount of activity as far as employment, economic development, houses, restaurants, shops. There's a lot there's a lot of players who benefit, and obviously tax base. I mean, that's where the real action is the tax and royalties opportunities. Some states are moving fast. There's a number of states that are really out front. Colorado is way out in front on this. Now, New York has imposed a ban on fracking for now. Pennsylvania has embraced it wholeheartedly. There's places in Pennsylvania, if you haven't spent it, there's places in Pennsylvania where there's been virtually no economic activity other than just small farms for years. And economic situation in those counties has been pretty grisly for a long time. Now, amazingly, I went to, our firm was involved in it's the Marcellus Shale Coalition. And it's interesting because we don't represent oil and gas producers up there very much. And it's just, but they learn that LNG is being transported to help run the fracking operations. Liquefied natural gas is being trucked from one spot to another. The trucks are also active in moving water. And a lot of people have made millions of dollars just going to the fire hydrant, loading up the truck with water, and that's what's used as the water in the fracking process. I mean, there's a lot of millionaires being made. It sounds insane, but that's how people are making their money. There's been no opportunity to get anything for a really long time, and this is it. So they're moving on it, and it's causing problems, huge problems as well as benefits. Water stress, water politics, and for those of you who've been around the world and know that water is a very emotional issue no matter where you go. I was in Ireland. It is almost an obsession with the water in Ireland, it's a human right. And when I was at Rio Plus 20, on behalf of the American Bar Association, access to fresh, clean water, access to food, access to energy for all, sustainable energy for all, they are basically being built in as basic human rights. And so the water issue is front and center, which makes it so complex because we want to provide energy for all, we want food to be grown for all, and trying to manage the water supply that's available and keep it safe and drinkable is a big challenge. You know all this, but just the hydraulic frac water cycle, just to have a sense. First, you have to get the water. That's one issue to use in the fracking process. Then you got to transport it and mix it up, unless you're taking it right out of the river. You have to inject it into the well. And then what do you do with this produced water? Well, leave it underground, or you truck it away. And where are you going to truck it to? Good question. You can't dump it in the river. Better not, or in the bay. You have to take it to a water treatment plant. Okay, there's a water treatment plant set up to deal with it. That's a very interesting question. So that's just one of the many issues. Hot button issue, groundwater contamination. Obviously, when if the fracking fluids are injected back, they're going to sit there. What's in those fluids? What's mixed in with the water? Who knows? How do they find out? That's one of the big hot issues, is how do you find out what's in the water? What chemical has been put into it? This horizontal drilling techniques, which are part of this, in many cases, the fracking process, that takes a lot of water into the ground as well. But EPA is hard at work on this, and they really are. They're spending time and money, your taxpayer money, and then also, they're just spending a lot of money on it. And at present, they're doing a variety of studies. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them are in Louisiana that have this total devotion to figuring out impacts on water supply to the same extent as they are. They've done some in Pennsylvania. I think Texas and Wyoming are the major states that they've been operating in, trying to figure out impacts. But there's a huge amount of this going on. This is a 5-year, multi-year study, very intense. It's retrospective, but it is intense, and it studies just about everything there is to study about groundwater contamination. They've issued one big study already. It's still in process, but basically they've issued a draft study and have been issuing paper after paper on it. And they've gotten a lot of data from just about everybody, environmental groups, NGOs, oil and gas industry, frac focus, scientists, computer modeling people out of all the universities, lab studies, toxicity assessments, and so on. So let me skip here. I know, how am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay, I better wrap this up. Okay, let me crash through here. I've mentioned the earthquakes to you, but that is also being studied very aggressively. Studied on a state level, local level, national level as well. Air issues, our primary focus in this panel is on water, but I can tell you the air issues are also getting a lot of attention. What's going on at the well sites, emissions at the well sites, increased truck traffic and all the rest, but also pipeline leaks and just general leaks at the well sites. That's getting an awful lot of attention. And EPA is also working with the states on that. Setting aside just what the federal government is doing for a moment, I mentioned to you the various state approaches. A variety of states have just out and out said no. Vermont, New York, for starters. But there's a lot of pressure in New York. A border right next to the fracking sites in Pennsylvania. They look across the border and people getting rich across, a lot of people getting rich across the border in Pennsylvania. Economic development in New York, many parts of upstate and central New York is practically nil. There's a tremendous hunger for economic activity in whatever form it comes in. It's a classic case of we need it now, we need something because it's been so tough up there. There's no economic growth in many parts of upstate New York, and they see Pennsylvania, at least some parts of Pennsylvania, thriving. It's interesting, too, the international bans on fracking. Of course, the British have banned fracking. Interesting. They've been drilling offshore Scotland for a long time, and as they go around the world, they've invested very heavily. The British companies, the French companies, the Spanish companies, all the international companies, U.S. companies invested any place where there's a fracking opportunity. Pretty much they've gone there. Okay, my timer tells me it's time to shut up, so I will. But let me just whip through a couple more points here. I want you to take a look at the export issue. Very, very interesting. That's a lot of what's going on in Louisiana and Texas and other parts of the country, too. But U.S. is going to be a big gas exporter. It's already on its way to doing that, a number of the projects. Here, the pipelines are being reconfigured. Pipelines moving, used to go traditionally up from the Gulf Coast. Now there's pipelines coming down to the Gulf Coast where the gas will be put into LNG liquefaction plants, and then it will be shipped beyond, exported to a variety of countries around the world. There's a lot going on at DOE and FERC with respect to this. Permits, authorizations, very, very interesting, big dollar investments from all over the planet coming to this. Desperate need for natural gas in a lot of our countries that we're friends with. Let me just say, in our relationship with China, you heard earlier today about the greenhouse gas agreements and our agreements on climate change with China, which were a breakthrough. Was part of that, how's China going to run its electricity grid? Yeah, right now they're heavily dependent on coal and nuclear. Well, they want some natural gas, thank you very much, because they don't have much of their own, even though we've invested and sent a lot of people to study fracking in China. But they have to run the electricity grid somehow, and that's a key part of this. So I've included in here maps that have all of the a lot of information on the export projects and new pipeline projects, because it's all about frack gas. I mean, that's what's driving this whole thing. It's driving so much of the economic activity in the country. And if you look at where the employment increases have been in the country in the past 4 or 5 years, much of it is in the oil and gas industry. You know that from being down here. So much of the activity is associated with it, for good or bad. So it's a very interesting dynamic as to, it's the best of times or the worst of times. Do you break open champagne or do you hide in your under your covers at home? I don't know. It depends on your perspective. But anyway, thank you. And the slides have a lot of good information on it. It's just an amazing dilemma that we're in as to where our energy supply comes from. And there are no easy answers. There's no free lunch, no matter what you do. Nuclear, coal, gas, oil. Renewables, everybody wants renewables in theory, but they don't want it in their backyard. They don't want the wind farm in their backyard, and they don't want the birds being crispy fried out of the air either. So, yeah, go figure. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Well, we have time for questions.
I have one for Mr. Seidman. Hi. You were talking about state control over waters and going from the navigable waters, which are more obvious, and then you discussed the Creek situation, the Smithport Lake situation. In St. Tammany, the question has come up many times from citizens. It's been said, well, don't worry, if we don't take the water from the scenic river, we'll take it from private ponds. And a lot of, that begs the question about how those ponds are fed, which that keeps getting asked, and that's going to have to be answered at some point very, very soon in that parish. So where do you see that going?
I don't know, to be honest. That's one that has not come up to us through any kind of official request.
Can you swing around so the line is near you too?
No.
Or you can come up here and join me.
I think it'll be soon, though. That's what I'm saying.
I don't disagree with that. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question that's inherent in some of the stuff I talked about, but it's one that we haven't looked at because it hasn't come up to us yet. And I think at that point, if it does, it's going to depend on the source of the pond. Dependent on, and that was one of the parts of the slides that I didn't get to, was the groundwater versus surface water issue. If it is a pond that's being fed from a groundwater source, under Louisiana law, that's rule of capture. And so while we may have some authority over the water well drilling and things like that, the stuff itself, the water itself is really treated as a mineral. But if it is being diverted from a public water source, different question. I think in that scenario, then we would have some regulatory authority.
So it draws from the aquifer, it all would be diverted from the public source.
The way that we understand Louisiana law is that diversion from the aquifer it's still groundwater, and that's a private source like a mineral.
And when you, just very quickly, because I know there are other
Sure.
questions, you talked about diversion before, and you explained that if there under certain circumstances, diversion is okay as long as it's returned, basically. I don't know if that's that situation you're talking about, but you can't return frac fluid.
Oh, absolutely.
You can't really return it.
Absolutely. No, we certainly agree with that concept, that if you're diverting from a surface water for fracking purposes, it's consumed. It is not possible to return it. And what I was referring to, I think, was the more historic rule that you're diverting it for a fish pond or something and then putting, and then it flows in and back out.
This is from Ms. Hollis. You talk about the tax revenue from fracking. Louisiana has a tax exemption on horizontal drilling, which lasts 2 years until the well is paid for. These wells play out very quickly. So where's the benefit, the public benefit, off of these operations when the actual public revenue, the public share, is exempted?
Yeah. Well, a number of states have imposed taxes on oil and gas, development. And all I can say is I can't speak to the trade-offs in Louisiana. There's always legislation fine-tuning. Maybe you ramp up the taxes sooner, or you get a tax that's an acceptable tax. Easier said than done. I'm sitting up there next to the Capitol, so.
Yeah, could I spin off of that question, and then I have another for Ryan. One is, all of this booming and, oh, were you pointing to someone else?
I was.
You're sure.
It appears to me that there, from a state perspective, there's a limited or perhaps a partial recognition that groundwater and surface water are interrelated and are pragmatically a single resource.
Absolutely.
And that's
It is.
that's well established, and there's a lot
Yeah.
of applications out there. The USGS has a really good circular on that.
True. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, there is an artificial dichotomy in the law that says groundwater and surface water are different things.
Check Arizona.
I'm sorry.
Check Arizona.
And that is unfortunately, for folks in my position, as either enforcers of the law or interpreters of the law, we're stuck with what the legislature's done and what the courts have done in those terms. But I think, as the USGS has said, and we certainly don't dispute, it's a misnomer to legally treat those as two separate things. Unfortunately, for now, I'm stuck in that, in that framework when we deal with enforcement issues. And I think that's one of the things that it's certainly been topics of discussion in concept for the water code issue is whether we can retool that concept legislatively. So it's on the radar screen, I could say that. I don't know if that answers your question.
You turn it over.
Okay. This is also to you, Ron. As I understand it now, if you have jurisdiction by one of these two methods, then it goes to DNR for permitting?
For permitting and review, yeah.
Okay. And that permit review is controlled by the constitutional review of SOF, by...
More or less, yes.
Right.
It's the save ourselves questions.
Right. For those in the audience who aren't familiar with it, the Supreme Court has elaborated, and legislature has followed a drill where any time the state takes an action, they do a mini environmental impact statement to consider alternatives. So my question is, when they're issuing these permits, what is the range of alternatives that are being considered here? Is it other locations, other fuels? Is it other uses of water, other sources of water?
That much I don't know. That I can just tell you honestly that for the analysis that's being done at DNR, once that process was implemented there, we haven't, our office hasn't been involved in the questions that they're asking. So I don't know the answer to that.
It seems to me that the handle on this stuff and the water withdrawal is it not, the recycling and reuse of the frack water. At that point, they're not drawing more because they're reusing.
Correct.
And I think state leverage exists for to get to that result. And I would encourage you to be thinking about it.
No, definitely. I think that's a reasonable point. And the other point that I wanted to add back to that was, and I think part of the reason that we're not involved in the scientific questions and analysis that's being done unless the thing comes back to, well, not back to us, to us. Because now that the process is in place, the folks just go to DNR for the permit for the review. And the only time we see it ever at this point is if somebody is not complying. And there have been a handful of them. Not lately, but not long after the law and the process went into place, there were a couple of small operators that bucked the process, and DNR had to request our assistance with forcing them to comply. None of them resulted in litigation, so there's nothing to report, and it never got to a question then of
content of the review.
Absolutely. So yeah. So that's really where my ignorance comes from. Is yeah, we know the process is in place. We know that there have been people that haven't complied. Once we've gotten involved, then they have complied. So we've not had to get into the nitty-gritty yet.
Okay.
One of the concerns amongst geologists is the production of produced waters from the black shales, the fracking shales. And the high levels of normally occurring radioactive materials which come from the black shales. I've been reading some scientific papers which have the levels as much as 1,000 times greater than background levels of radiation which are in the produced waters. My question is, what is the state of Louisiana looking at the levels of radiation in produced waters from the Tuscaloosa and the Haynesville shales? What sort of monitoring is being done by the state, and are you regulating that?
The unfortunate answer to that question, again, is that's the DNR DEQ issues that I can't speak to. I don't know. We're really the enforcement arm for them when they've got issues with certain operators. It's never come across my desk, so I don't know what their monitoring activities or lack thereof are. I just don't know the answer.
Could I follow up with that question with Ms. Hollis?
Sure.
Is EPA looking at a norm, the radioactivity, and the fact that it exceeds the drinking water standards by thousands of times? Yeah. Is EPA doing anything?
I have no idea. I only know, what they're doing with respect to these specific reviews, and I don't know about. I just don't know. But of course, they have to know about the issue, and then they can determine whether they're going to put the resources into it. But the EPA is extremely active on all this stuff. I mean, they're really deep into all over the place. You have to pick these 5 studies because they provided the best record. I think those are the choices, and they have access to records and they can monitor it so closely. But they have to. EPA just has to know these things. I know EPA is extremely worried about what chemicals are in the water, which makes perfectly good sense. So it would seem to me that would be in that slate of issues. And if there's a high degree of radioactivity that's showing up in those waters, is it just naturally occurring?
Well, it's produced by the fracking. The fact that they're fracking the shales is releasing this higher concentration of radioactive minerals, and that's coming out in the produced waters.
But the minerals are there to begin with.
The minerals are there to begin with, but they're being released by man's fracking.
Yeah.
And that's when they come to the surface, and they're essentially a result of the fracking process, and then they're in the produced waters.
It reminds me of Colorado, which is, it looks like you may actually have heard of this because you're sort of maybe I don't want to overstate, maybe the same age range, but they did something called Project Rulison, in which they were going to detonate an atomic weapon in Colorado to release the gas, a small atomic bomb. I think they shut it down, but Project Rulison is one of the great scandals of all time in Colorado. And this is under federal government authority.
Well, we had one in Mississippi. They did the same thing. They set off the atomic bomb south of Hattiesburg, and now we have radioactive waters around that salt dome.
Oh, my God.
I have 2 questions also for Ms. Sheila, I think. One is regarding public health effects, and the second one is regarding the United Nations Thirsty Energy Initiative, which involves water. When I looked at the slide that you showed that had the environmental groups and community groups all involved with frac quakes and air and water and ESA issues and land use, I was shocked to see that public health was not on that list. I'm part of Alert Project. I get Exxon Valdez survivor. I get called all around the country. I call them Toxic Tours of America. I was just recently in Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, upper Midwest area. People are like sick, and they're like, why am I sick? Why is my neighbor sick? What's going on? So because this took off so fast, the hydraulic pressuring, the public health component, I think, is lagging way behind. Medical doctors are now starting to do webinars, occupational environmental webinars. This is getting out. So one question is, do you foresee, this is going to hit like a ton of bricks. People are getting sick from this. How do you foresee this segueing into or impacting this rosy future of natural gas extraction?
Well, I think first OSHA will be the canary in the mine. OSHA's doing a lot with respect to worker safety, and I think Health and Human Services is looking into the impacts. I don't know to what level they've taken it, but I do think that HHS is looking into these types of issues. Union of Concerned Scientists, I know, has done some studies on it, and they're a very proactive group, and are tied in with the federal government. They have interactions with them on an ongoing basis and testify quite a bit. I would expect that this will come up as a further issue. I think it will vary. Obviously, it's varying from site to site is what is actually transpiring. And it may be a compounding of already oil and gas that's being developed, and it has been developed over time, where there's already been a huge amount of production over time in these places, and trying to decide what's now and what's happening, and whether it's this cumulative impact, the cumulative effects are so great. But it all has, look, it's all going to have an impact. EPA, this is part of EPA's mandate, is to look at human. That's one of the things in a NEPA analysis is what is the effect on human health and safety. And NEPA, NEPA is a process whereby you have to tick all the boxes. So if there's the NEPA process vis-a-vis what's going on public lands it takes place.
Well, the second part of just more of an alert is that I became aware in Oklahoma of what you talked about with the truckers just hitching up to fire hydrants and taking water and emptying ponds. And people were saying, how is this possible? And I researched it, and I found something called the United Nations Thirsty Energy Initiative, and I just wanted to bring this to both of your attention if you're not aware of it already. It apparently is a UN directive to transnational companies to encourage them to go into these small municipalities and kind of buddy up and chum up and come up with memorandums of understanding to be able to use their water to get municipalities water. And it's called, this is how we're going to get sustainable energy. They're actually calling fracking a sustainable energy.
Wow.
So it's something to look at.
That's the biggest UN and the one I was at. Real plus 20. I don't know where these guys are going, but boy, they were burning us alive. I mean, they had, I would say I'm lighting them up. Fracking was not a really popular subject to bring up at the real plus 20.
Liza.
Just a quick question to Ryan. Hi. With the 2010 and extended law, is there a public notice provision?
A public notice provision
For the permit.
for the permit?
Yeah, for the permit.
Not that I recall.
It sort of fits in with the question of, or at least what are you seeing coming across your desk? And if there's no public notice, you're not going to see much come across your desk.
Yeah, and again, this is one of these things that I think falls to wisdom of the legislature. The legislature put the drafting of the process for dealing with the water usage in the jurisdiction of the Mineral Board. Now, the Mineral Board doesn't administer the leases. It's not an employee of the Mineral Board that does the environmental reviews, but my suspicion is that that was never even on the radar screen of either the legislature in drafting that, or, and to be honest, I can't remember whether we had that in our original drafts or not, or the Mineral Board in actually coming up with the forms for it. So it doesn't surprise me.
Because you also were talking about that you've got the public trust doctrine reviews going on at this time. For the cases I see, we question whether those have happened. But
Sure.
those are the ones coming to my desk. But that's they only get there through the public notice process. So sort of something to keep an eye out for if anybody thinking on it.
Yes, sir. And
A quick comment on that. The PowerPoint that I got from the Commission of Conservation states that they can actually receive oral approval to drill a fracking well. So that's how regulated.
I think that's a distinction between the fracking well and the water source. And what I was speaking to was the water source.
Yeah, that was my question, although I guess I wondered as a follow-up how much, you spoke about it in terms of charging, and there's a permit, but is there, and you mentioned the public trust document, as if they intersect there, which should, but how much, it's an opportunity to put in the levers that I was talking about with with regulations, because not, there's costs other than dollar value.
Absolutely.
So, does that happen? And I know you were
Does
short
what
on
happen?
time, but are there regulations about limitations?
There are no regulations under 955.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, and as a matter of fact, my feeling on that is that we had probably naively hoped that 955 was going to lead to further legislation. But no, and 955 does not grant any authority for regulation drafting. It just says, Mineral Board, thou shalt come up with this form, and thou shalt do, an environmental review for each.
It's almost treated like licensing more than permitting?
Fair analogy, I think.
Thanks.
Sir?
Two things. One, point of clarification, the naturally occurring radioactive materials in the fluids and the formations that are being looked at are there as a function of the rates of relative radioactive decay and mineral solubility. And so the fluids are extracted and they're diluted by essentially diluted by the fracking fluids, so that anything that comes up will have higher levels. But the fracking itself is not what's causing the release. So, and then I have a question for Ms. Hollis. You said that natural gas is going to be the bridge to the future, which to me would suggest that it's not the end all for energy supply. And given the finite nature of hydrocarbon resources and reserves, from where you sit, what potential do you see for serious consideration for nuclear generation in the long term?
Well, there's a lot of countries building a lot of nuclear generation right now. French are building them all over the world. China,
I should have said in the U.S.
In the U.S., well, we've got about 3 plants going. We've got that are new. We've got one in South Carolina. There's another one in Georgia. I think there's another one in Tennessee. But it's been very slow going, and they always, it's very frustrating because they always run over, the cost overruns are so great. Just that South Carolina one is $1 billion overrun already. It's just unbelievable. And so it's been slow going. These SMRs, small modular reactors, seem to have a lot of attraction because you can do a 6-pack of them. I know I'm doing my techie talk here. Okay, but they're smaller, they're easier to manage, they're easier to build, easier to site, and all the rest. So these SMRs have gotten a lot of play. It's going to take a lot. There's a very deep-seated anti-nuclear movement in this country still. It's never disappeared. And then you have the Fukushima event, which is impacting, which has caused everybody to stop and think about it all over again. The NRC is an agency, of course it doesn't promote. In a perfect world, it would be great if people had confidence. We will have to embark, if we're going to do this, we better do it fast because every plant we have, every operating non-military plant in the country is 35 to 40 years old, and most of them are over 40 by now.
And there haven't been any, or very few, if any, new permits issued.
Correct. Except what they do is it's called license renewal. It's kind of like license extensions, which gives them another 20 years. But because it's very interesting, the market dynamics right now, because the price of gas has been so low, they're trying to sell power onto the grid, but the cost of operating a nuclear plant, you don't just operate a nuclear plant like you do a natural gas-fired plant. You could have 25 people in a natural gas-fired plant, which would be a lot of people, because it's a simple operation. But in a nuclear plant that's 45 years old, you've got to have 600 people. And they have to be inspect. You have 2 nuclear NRC people on site 24/7. The incredible amount of regulatory oversight and fixing. Now they can make a fortune sometimes, but it's very tricky, and we have to face up, and that's why gas. Nobody likes Oprah. We're going to do it with renewables, well, sort of. You do some percentage, but there's land use issue. It's great. Colorado, the whole field around there's zillions of acres of solar. It worked great in Colorado and works great in a lot of places. Some of the wind works good. Getting offshore wind built almost impossible. Skip it. You know, they've had the Cape Wind project that's been going on 11, 12 years. There's no offshore wind, okay, off the table. So you've got onshore wind, but you know that hasn't been a walk in the park either, because the noise issues, the birds, this, that, the other thing, and then also the structure of the grid. There's a whole, I could go on about this, probably bore the hell out of everybody in the room, but the structure of the grid is not yet set up to accept huge surges of wind power. So you have to figure out, well, where are you going to store this stuff? You know, electricity, it isn't like natural gas. You can have a storage field. No, this stuff, when it comes on, it comes in a huge surge. Now, in some parts of the world, the wind flows in a very predictable pattern. But there's been a lot of wind power built where that's not the case. So trying to reconfigure the grid modernization is a huge issue. The security of the grid is just such a huge issue. You know, and there's so many worries about the security of the grid, cybersecurity and physical security of the grid. We've already had incursions on physical incursions. We've had cyber incursions every day. The grid is hit with literally hundreds of thousands from all parts of the world, China, North Korea, you name it, are hitting the grid cyber security structure. And that maybe just one plant tripped the plant off, and that'll cause a cascade. I represented the grid in the blackout of 2003, and it had some astonishing impacts. And this is something that the White House works on, and everybody is very, very focused on this issue. So the grid is shaky, okay? It's an old grid, it's vulnerable, and trying to make it less vulnerable is part of the thing. And trying to incorporate these new sources of energy from all over that aren't predictable is very difficult. Yeah. Yes, I should actually be doing this.
Yeah, well, I have one more question, and you had your hand up a while earlier.
I was just going to respond to your comment about, is there any advertising or notification for fracking operations? And there was a bill introduced last session by Representative Burns that I would characterize it as laughed off the floor. He got 14 votes out of 105.
Okay,
So much for notification.
Thank you.
And Eric, you had a question.
I had
That's our last one.
This is a question for Sheila. There was a lot of discussion at DNR up in Baton Rouge about the fact that the federal government has an initiative to expand the definition of the water that's governable by federal statute.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with that, could you just bring us up to date on the status of that?
What constitutes
whether it has to be running water or whether it's
right. Whether it's navigable water, well, that's a whole other issue. Navigable water is regulatable by the federal government. It is, in fact. It's just an extension of that, and the tributaries and all the rest of it, I think, may be it. And also, you know, the harbors, all that are regulated.
Well, this was seasonal.
Oh, sure. Well, that's a very interesting question. You know, hydroelectric, I didn't mention it. I didn't even really get into hydro, but hydro in this country, what gives the FERC jurisdiction over hydroelectric plants? It's not just whether the water's flowing now and it's a navigable river or stream. No, it's whether it ever flowed and was ever navigable. That is, if you had Native Americans who had a canoe on it in 1775 that they could document, then FERC can regulate it now, okay? The navigability issue is still a huge issue. It's very interesting.
Well, you mentioned we're a wet state, and it's a lot better if you include the
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. And right about now, I believe lunch is served downstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.